Over the past 3 years, I've been able to share more than 100 of my personal best car stories. That's what this channel is all about, and I can't express how much fun it's been and what a true honor it is to have this platform and to be able to share them with so many more people than I'd ever be able to in my normal sphere of influence and daily life. So I'm glad that you've enjoyed them, but I thought today it'd be an awful lot of fun to look back at our top 10 stories from my playlist on this channel, my top 10 car stories. And each of these has well over 1 million views. It's absolutely crazy, nothing I ever would have imagined, but I found it very interesting to see which ones have gotten the most views, see which ones you like. Some of them I'm not surprised by, some of them I am, but I hope that you enjoy my top 10 car stories. I look at the cop and I'm like, what are you doing? Arrest this guy. No response whatsoever. Around 2011 and 12, we started to get a lot of demand for exotic cars from South America. And at that point, the dealer network there was kind of underdeveloped, and it was still a fairly novel concept that it was actually safe enough to drive cars that valuable in those countries, particularly Brazil, because that's where a lot of the calls were coming from. But we weren't being contacted by the end users down there. Instead, it was brokers or businesses in South Florida that were exporting the cars. And since it's against our franchise agreement to sell cars that we know are probably going to be exported, it wasn't really up to me whether or not we took these deals. So I would talk to my general manager, and at the time he was pretty open to that. He wanted to sell as many as we could, and so if that's what this meant, okay. So there was one guy in particular that we dealt with a lot, and he was very professional and easy to deal with and made expectations clear and communicated well, and he became a great client. I would sell him 5 to 10 cars a year. And in general, he would just call and say, I've got a guy that wants a Gallardo, he's open to these colors, what do you have? And he would just buy something out of our inventory. He would give us a deposit, and 2 or 3 weeks later, he'd have the rest of the money and he would send it. It can take a long time to get that amount of money out of South America, so it was nice to have this kind of buffer, not only for some plausible deniability, but to make the transactions a little bit more convenient. But about a year into the relationship, he came to me and said he had a request for 2 very specific cars. A guy wanted a yellow 2012 brand new Gallardo Performante and a 2012 Bentley Continental Flying Spur Speed. And I could find the Gallardo through another dealer, but obviously we weren't a Bentley dealer. And so I told him, let me do a day or two of research. I'll find us a car, figure out what discounts are available, and I'll get you one. So the next day I found a white one, exactly what he wanted, with the right options at a good discount, and he was happy. But we had to kind of lay down the rules a little bit differently, because we told him, look, in most cases, if your deal falls apart, we'll be happy to give you your deposit back. And we had in some cases, but in this case, we're having to secure 2 cars and buy them, let the warranties start, that we really don't want for inventory. So we need a bigger deposit, and truly in this case, it is non-refundable. And he agreed with that, but he said, look, I don't have a bunch of cash right now, but I do have an almost brand new BMW X6 that I secured for a client. He gave me a deposit, and then he didn't consummate the transactions. So why don't I give you that and the title as a non-refundable deposit on these cars? So we agreed to that. It was worth about 55 grand. So we bought the other 2 cars and brought them into inventory. And a couple weeks later, kind of as you'd imagine, his deal fell apart. So we ended up owning this brand new Lamborghini and this brand new Bentley that we really didn't want. And we didn't know what it was really going to take to sell them. And they sat around for a very long time. But eventually we did sell the Bentley to some professional golfer. I don't remember who it was, not Tiger Woods. And the Gallardo just sort of sat around for a good long while. And a couple months later, my boss was like, guys, we have got to move this Gallardo. And at that time, the $200,000 or so price point that the LP 550s were at, those cars sold great, but the $280 to $300 LP 570s sat around for a good long while. And he was starting to get nervous about it, and so we were trying to call anybody, but I didn't have anybody I could just snap my fingers and sell the car to. And around that time, there was a guy who came in fairly often trying to test drive cars. And in general, we didn't test drive many cars, and certainly not new cars, and never early in the process. We would already have dealt with when you want to buy, how you want to pay, what the contingencies are, what we've got to deal with before that, because we weren't worried about you not liking the way the car drove. And if you were just trying to drive a car to see which one you'd eventually want to buy, I mean, that's what magazines are for. So we weren't doing much test driving, and certainly I wasn't, and I really didn't deal with that many people that were showroom ups that just walked in, because about 80% of my business at that point was repeat customers. But this guy had come in a few times fishing for test drives, and I just kind of deflected it, and he'd get a little bit upset, but then just sort of leave. And he was an exceedingly unpleasant person to deal with. He had said that his wife was some professional tennis player, and that he had some tech startup that he was in the process of selling to Microsoft for like $80 million, but he wouldn't wouldn't tell us who she was or what the business did or what it was called or anything like that. And obviously the guy's lying, but regardless, he would just go away and it wasn't that big of a deal. But he showed up one Saturday and I was busy doing something else, so he started talking to one of my coworkers. And a little bit less gracefully than I would tend to, he refused to let this guy test drive a car. And things got a little heated, then they got more hostile, then they got a little bit combative. And they were shouting at each other and he was screaming profanity across our showroom. And I'm over in the corner with some cappuccino and popcorn just ready for the fireworks to start, because this coworker of mine generally kept more firearms on his person or around his desk than a Jason Bourne movie. But my general manager didn't like the circumstance, so he stepped in and tried to diffuse everything. And his solution was, let me let you talk to Ed. So he calls me over and he's like, Ed knows everything about Lamborghinis. He'll be happy to help you with whatever you want to do. I said, all right, hey, I'm Ed Bolian. How can I help you? So he said, I want to test drive that yellow Lamborghini right now. And I said, well, it's really up to him, my general manager here. If he wants you to, I'll be more than happy to pull it out. He said, yep, whatever you want. Ed, go get the keys, get it out of here. So we began the 20 or 30 minute process of shuffling all these cars around to get this car out of the showroom, because Saturdays are the worst possible day to test drive a car at an exotic car dealership. The showrooms are full of Instagram photographers and everybody's busy doing different things, delivering cars to people coming in from out of town. So it's just a terrible time to tie up an hour or two with a particular customer, especially one that you know is not going to buy a car. So we get the car out of the showroom and we head out on the test drive. And our test drive route is actually dictated by our insurance provider, and it's designed to be an easy way to show someone a car in a very safe way. So it's mostly right turns with good visibility, no unaided lefts, and we kind of go down a state highway and then we loop around an exit where there's a MARTA station, our local Georgia public transit, and then back up to the dealership. So it's about a 10-mile loop and we drive the first 5 miles, just kind of showing them how all the controls work. And this was before all the accidents that would happen in the subsequent years, so our insurance company really liked us and we wanted to keep it that way. So I was behaving myself, although we didn't tend to along that route, because that state highway is technically speed patrolled by the Georgia State Patrol, not the local cops. And there's no good places for them to set up speed traps, and since it's kind of the only road like that on the north part of town, there really are never cops on this route. And that's kind of strategic on our part, because sometimes we really want to show people what the cars can do. And as we talked about in the press car video, you can go pretty fast along our test drive route. But in this case, I was behaving myself, just kind of showing them, all right, this is the car, this is the speed limit. Let's just see how things go and keep everything safe. So we get to the point where we change seats, kind of in a parking deck at this MARTA station, and he gets in the driver's seat. And I make sure his mirrors are adjusted, his steering wheel's where he wants it, everything's comfortable. And he starts driving. And this guy goes absolutely insane. I mean, immediately just full acceleration, hard braking, upsetting the balance of the car. I mean, there are elegant ways to speed, and this was not that. It was dangerous, it was entirely out of control, and I immediately said, dude, this is not how we're gonna drive. Like, you can try to experience the car and see what you like, but this is not how we're gonna behave in this car on this test drive. And he would kind of back off and then immediately just speed back up. And I'm like, sir, I got to ask you to slow down. Like, we cannot drive like this. I understand that you want to see what the car can do, but this is not how we're going to do it. And again, he kind of slowed down, but he kept just speeding up, and he's going 130, 140 miles per hour, weaving in and out of cars. And I finally say, sir, if you persist like this, I'm going to have to ask you to pull over and we got to switch seats. And he's like, no, I'm driving the car. And then fortunately, about a quarter mile ahead, I see a local cop driving in our same direction. And I said, sir, there's a cop. Let's just behave ourselves. We need to keep a good relationship with them. And he goes, no. Downshifting 2 gears, flooring the throttle, and accelerating as hard and fast as he can at the rear of this police car. And I'm like, whoa, what are you doing? And he slams on the brakes and comes within inches of this cop's rear bumper. I mean, just tailgating this guy. And I'm like, well, fantastic. This is going to save us all. He's going to pull him over, give him a ticket for following too close, and I'll get to drive back to the dealership. No, the cop doesn't even notice. He goes, watch this. And I go, no, please don't. And he downshifts again, floors the car, barely avoids knocking the cop's mirror off, and flies away from him well over 100 miles an hour. And of course, we got the top down on this Performante convertible. I look at the cop and I'm like, what are you doing? Arrest this guy. No response whatsoever. So as he's accelerating away from this completely non-responsive cop, he looks over at me and says, I am invincible. And I said, well, I'm not. And I'm like, this is how I'm gonna die. I don't know what witchcraft this guy is capable of, but I don't know what's happening in my life at all right now, but I know we have a cloverleaf exit coming up in half a mile, and this guy doesn't have any clue how to drive a car, so we're gonna flip over and die right about now. And magically we didn't. The cop never responded in any way, but we made it around that turn, and I said, "Sir, we're almost back. Please just drive carefully." And somehow we managed to get back with the car in one piece and us all still alive, and I have no idea how that happened, but of course, as you would imagine, he immediately said, "Well, let me continue to think about it and I'll call you if I decide this is what I want to buy." And he immediately departed without saying anything to anybody else at the dealership. And I walked back in, and of course their first question is, "Well, is he going to buy it?" I said, "You guys got to be kidding me." And as we might say, he was a shrewd negotiator. So growing up, I was always fascinated by Roof. I loved the philosophy of their cars, of taking a brilliant car in the Porsche 911 and then just making it kind of to the moon and back, modifying it to be so fast. We've all seen the videos of the Yellowbird tearing around the Nürburgring, and most of us played Gran Turismo and saw that instead of Porsche we had Roof, which we didn't know much about, but it was this fascinating brand that were really, really fast and stood up against all the hypercars of really any era they were up against. And I just was enamored with the idea of the cars. It actually seemed like a great car for Cannonball. You know, it was lightweight, aerodynamic, prioritized top speed, was generally fuel efficient. It had everything going for it, but you never saw them. But back in 2012, I'd organized a trip from Lamborghini Atlanta with some Lamborghini owners down to the Esperienza, which is sort of Lamborghini's customer-facing track driving experience program. And we were driving from Atlanta to Palm Beach to go to PBIR and drive the Aventadors and Superleggers and everything else on the track. And on the way down, one of my guys in a Performante had a tire pressure monitor break internally, and it was rattling around in the barrel of his wheel. And so we stopped at Lamborghini Palm Beach and asked them to dismount the tire and fix it, and they were happy to do so. But while we were wandering around there was a car in their service bay, and it was a Roof. And I asked the general manager, I was like, what's the deal with this car? Are y'all selling it, servicing? He said, "I don't even want to talk about it. I hate that car. We're involved in this terrible lawsuit with the owner, and it's just getting really, really nasty. I'd like it never to be here again, but it's going to be here for quite some time." And I went on to find out that the previous general manager had taken the car in on consignment when the guy ordered an Aventador. And the wait for Aventadors at that point was 1.5 to 2 years. And so he had a car coming in late in 2012. They were going to consign the car at like 199 grand and see if it sold. But if it didn't, he had promised him a trade allowance of 130,000 against his Aventador. The new general manager had come in without much familiarity about what Roof was. And he saw that number and said, "Absolutely not. I'm not going to put that much money in this car. I've got the hottest car on earth in this Aventador, and I've got this thing that I don't know, I don't like, and we've been trying to sell for 1.5 years, and nobody seems to want." And so he had told the guy, "Look, I'm going to sell your car to somebody else, and you can keep your Roof or whatever, but I'm not giving you that." He had decided he thought it was worth 75 grand. At the time, that was probably what an 07 911 Turbo would have bought, and he kind of viewed it in that light. It was a 2006 RT12 that had been brought into the US and then taken back to the factory in Germany in 2009 to have the RT12S updates, which took it from 650 to 685 horsepower. But in reality, I think they all pretty much always made 730, or at least that's what I was told. And so he didn't really know what the car was. He just knew he didn't want it. And the owner was obviously offended at this offer. And so the lawsuit continued. And it went on for a couple of years, and I would occasionally check back in and say, "How's my Roof doing?" Because I'd told him, "Look, I see you don't want the car. If you get it traded, if you ever own it, just call me and I'll buy it from you." I had no idea if he'd ever get it anywhere near his price, but I thought, hey, anything close is a great deal. And it's a car I'd like to own. I've always kind of wanted a 911, but I wanted something a little bit more special, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. And it was kind of a weird spec. It was matte black with a cocoa brown interior. And that was a popular color when the 996 came out in terms of the interior. And what had actually happened was the car was GT silver originally, and he'd have it wrapped matte black when it came into the US, but then when you sent it back for the updates, he had them repaint it. So it was like another 50,000 euros for the updates in the paint. To me, there's kind of a quintessential spec. You can customize it in any way you want, but I wanted a narrow body car that was rear wheel drive, stick, had their integrated roll cage and all the aerodynamics and everything. And so this car, even though it's kind of a quirky combo, and certainly it had a tough life for the last couple of years sitting outside in South Florida, I just thought it was fantastic. It had the adjustable Moton suspension, and on paper it was just perfection. But as the years went on, I got worried and I figured I was never going to be able to buy it. And then that general manager that I knew well got moved to a different dealership, and I didn't know the new guy. And at that same time, they had settled the lawsuit in a way that he didn't know about, he wasn't sure, and so the car had left. And I was kind of upset about that. And I had left Lamborghini Atlanta back in November of 2015 to just take some time off with my family and look for something else to do. I didn't have anything particular in mind. Eventually, we ended up starting VINwiki, but I was kind of just sitting around through the holidays. And around Christmas in 2015, I was browsing around Craigslist and I saw a 2006 roof advertised on Craigslist in upstate New York. I'm like, it's an 06 matte black roof. And the mileage was consistent with what I thought it had. And there wasn't an asking price, but there was a phone number. So I called the guy and I said, do you actually have the car? And he said, no, I don't. I'm friends with the owner and he wants me to find him a real number for it. And you know, it's in Florida, but he's kind of nervous about things. And I said, well, this is what I know about it. And I gave him the whole rundown of the car's history for the last few years. And he was dumbfounded that anyone would have this amount of knowledge about the car, or that car in particular. And so we went back and forth a little bit, and I said, look, the car's got enough of a stigma because it's set outside and so many people have seen it. Why don't you just take the ad down and you and I will work something out. I promise you I'm a check writer. I'll be an easy deal. I know that the Lamborghini dealership wanted to offer him about 75 grand for the car. I also know it's going to need a lot because it's been sitting since they made him that offer. And so why don't we just, you and I talk a little bit more about it, but just take this listing down because I didn't want anybody else to call about it, and we'll figure something out. And as we might say, he was a shrewd negotiator, and so we went back and forth, and I offered him $69,000. And he wanted a $1,500 commission for managing the deal or whatever, and I was obviously happy to pay that. And as much as he tried to get me to come up, I just stuck there and ended up owning the car for $70,500 with his commission. The owner wanted to run the deal through Lamborghini Miami because he wanted to kind of stay out of it, and I was scared because I knew Brett David well. He's a consummate car enthusiast, and I figured, you know, when he sees this car come in through his inventory, he's going to notice that it's dirt cheap, and he's going to try to buy it out from under me. And I'm like, what am I going to do? But I didn't really have an option. And so I said, all right, well, we'll just do that. And I flew down there with a certified check and showed up to buy the car. And I get there and they're kind of hiding it from me. I'm like, where's the roof? And it was in the back. They had multiple battery chargers on it. It wouldn't start. The check engine lights were all on. It was just a mess. But I said, it's all right. It's okay. I'll get it figured out. Let's just put a new battery in it and I'll try to drive it home. My brother had actually flown in and we were both going to drive the car to Atlanta the next day. So we had an awesome road trip home. It was a little bit problematic because the car was acting up a little bit. It really hadn't been driven at that point, I think about 3 or 4 years. And so the wheels were leaking because the seals had dried out in the 3-piece OZ wheels. And Roof used the seats out of the Ferrari Enzo in the car, and they didn't really fit the cockpit as Porsche had designed it. So your knees were a little bit too upright and they weren't terribly adjustable. It was very hard to drive it without your hands hitting your knees, but we made it home. And the car was supposed to make 730 horsepower and go 228 miles an hour, but I think on the turnpike I was only able to get it to about 182 or 85. So I was a little bit disappointed, and I figured it was a little bit down on power, but I had no idea. So I got it home and started going through, fixed the wheels, fixed some paint things, and went through a few things on the car, and ended up getting some standard Carrera seats that just fit the car a lot better, or at least were a lot more comfortable. But I could not get the car to pass our Georgia OBD2 emissions scan. So I ended up getting in touch with the former mechanic of the only roof dealership in the US for the last 15 years that was in Dallas. And he said to make sure they're using the right OBD2 port. And I said, well, we're using an OBD2 port, and I don't think it's legal to have two. But he said, nope, there's absolutely a second one. You pull this trim panel off on the passenger side and plug right into it. And I guess one runs the 996 motor and one runs the 997 body. So the RT12s were a little bit peculiar because they didn't like the variable vane turbos for a while that were on the 997s, and so they kind of kept working with the cars. But eventually I got it back to the emissions place with the proper OBD2 port, and it would not pass for secondary evap or catalytic converter. So I called the factory and they said, well, you got to send the ECUs back and we'll send them over to Bosch and they'll program them. This was right around the time of Volkswagen Dieselgate, so I knew Bosch was up to the task. But the car was down for like 2 months when I sent it off. But finally got it back, got it registered, everything was good. But I just never fell in love with the car. It wasn't that comfortable, it definitely wasn't stable, and there were probably some issues. I think one of the shocks was starting to go, but it used this really complex Moton system with some kind of front end lift, and it definitely was not making that kind of power. I think it probably made 600 on its best day, and I was terrified to actually know what was wrong with it because there was nothing going to be cheap about trying to fix this car that was like, I think it was 260,000 euros new and then 50,000 for the update. So somebody had over 400 grand invested in this car at some point. And so I finally just got to the point, in fact, after I had bought the gray Murcielago and gotten rid of the green one, it was down for a couple of months as we were doing some cosmetic things and reconditioning it because it had lived kind of a tough life before I got it. And I ended up trying to trade the roof for another Murcielago. And it's one of those times where you sort of look in the mirror and you go, Ed, why are you like this? And it's just, it just wasn't really the car for me. It made all the sense in the world and couldn't seem better on paper, but in practicality, I just never fell in love with the thing. So I drove it a few thousand miles and had some fun and ended up talking to another dealer that had some experience selling some roof cars, and I sold it to him for 154 grand. So did a little better than doubling my money on it, and a little over a year I guess I had that car, but really enjoyed it for what it was and the experience of owning it. I think there were 3 RT12Ss in the US, or they still are as far as I know. And it was cool to use VINwiki to track the other ones and figure out where they were popping up, because this was a true W09 VIN car where Porsches were generally WP0. And so you can either send your Porsche to Roof to modify and they'll keep the VIN, or they'll build their own as they have OEM manufacturer status and they'll assign their own VIN. So this was one of those, and it was very, very special. People would come up at car shows like, is that an RUF or a rough or whatever? But it is Roof, and I had a blast, kind of learning more about the cars, but have certainly not missed it. I had my fun, I made my money and sent it on down the road, but sometimes you just never know until you meet your heroes what they're actually going to be like.
Kimmy, do you have butt implants?
Kimmy, do you have butt implants?
Kimmy, do you have butt implants?
Kimmy,
Do you have butt implants?
And I said to her, Kimmy, do you have butt implants?
Last week was my 100th car story here on the channel, and I've got plenty more to tell, but I was asking a few friends, like, what should I do to kind of commemorate that body of work or whatever it means? And the overwhelming consensus was to retell the prostitute Lamborghini story. So without any further ado, early in 2011, I was working as the director of sales at Lamborghini Atlanta, and we had a flatbed come in, and on the back of it there was a 2004 blue Chelum Lamborghini Gallardo. And these two guys got out. They didn't really speak much English, but as best we could understand it, they wanted us to tell them what it would take to get the car running, and it was as rough as a car that still in one piece could be. The tires were bald, the wheels were curved, every panel had some ding, dent, scratch, whatever. The taillights were broken, the door handle was broken off, and it obviously didn't start or run. And so we get it off and put it around back, and a couple days later we get it checked out. So we put it in the shop, and we could tell that it needed a clutch and a throwout bearing and a rear main seal and all the obvious wear and tear items. So it was a good 20 to 25 grand worth of stuff. And so we put it out back after diagnosing it, and we called the number that these two guys had left, but of course there's no answer. And so we try every morning but don't get anywhere. But a couple days later, this guy walks in and he says, hey, do y'all have a blue Lamborghini here for service? And we said, yes. Do you know anything at all about it? Can you tell us, do you want us to fix it? Is it yours? And he says, no, it's not mine. He said, it belongs to my girlfriend's daughter. and she's very attractive. And I said, well, thank you. That won't impact our level of service, sir, but it's always nice to know the information in the periphery. You know, can we talk to her or something like that? He said, no, she's not available right now, but let me see if I can get in touch with her mom and we'll see what we can do. And I said, okay, great. So the next couple days, we keep trying the number, no answer, but then the mom shows up. And she says, yeah, it belongs to my daughter. I don't think she's going to be able to pay to fix it, and she is in jail right now. She says she got arrested for going 180 miles per hour in this car. I was like, okay, well, can we get in touch with her? Is she going to get out? She's like, yeah, she should be out pretty quick. I'm like, okay, well, that doesn't make a ton of sense. But she said she'll probably want you to buy the car because I don't think she's going to fix it. We said, well, we can do that. That's what I told her. And she leaves, and we continue trying to get in touch. No response from anything. Even the numbers they had left, the boyfriend, the mom, nobody. So a couple days after that, Kimmy shows up. And Kimmy is a prostitute. And it might be politically correct to say she's allegedly a prostitute, but that would be a disservice to the 3 metro Atlanta municipalities that had convicted her of such things in the prior years. So she shows up, and as best I could understand it, Kimmy was half black and half Vietnamese. And certain parts of her appeared to be rather augmented. You might say that she had some aftermarket parts. And she was a very charming girl, probably one of the most interesting people I've ever come to know. But I suppose what Kimmy would say is her most marketable feature is her backside. I actually saw on one of her now banned social media profiles that Kimmy has 50-inch hips. So the girl could take a break while hula hooping. And so she shows up and she's telling us a little bit about her car, and she'd bought it about a year prior to that at Lamborghini Miami, paying all cash. And it had actually been about 9 months, and during that time, apparently somebody had bumped into it in a Wendy's drive-thru. Her mother was correct. She couldn't afford to fix the car. And so she asked us if we would buy it. And I had already talked to my general manager, and he had pretty much said, look, we don't want the thing for inventory. And he wasn't really comfortable representing it to other wholesalers because he didn't really know what the car was going to need beyond what we could immediately diagnose. Because once you put the clutch and everything else in it, then you could figure out if it needs a $17,000 shift actuator or an $8,000 front diff or all the other things that are kind of the time bomb problems on early Gallardos. Also, you never know if it's been run low on oil. It was a pretty low VIN. So there were a lot of kind of monsters in the closet. And so I had asked him, you know, look, if you don't want it, can I try to buy it? Because about a year and a half prior to that, my wife and I had bought one of T-Pain's Rappers 360s. It was in a similar circumstance. It needed about 10 grand worth of junk to be fixed enough to then drive, and we hoped nothing else happened, and it hadn't. So we had made some good money on that. I figured, hey, this might be a good way for lightning to strike twice. And so I was talking to Kimmy, and I said, all right, yeah, we can buy it, but actually it's going to be probably me buying it because honestly, there's nobody else bidding. And I asked her kind of, what does she want? And so her thinking she'd paid 100 grand for this car and it needs 20, 25 grand worth of work, she's like, well, I want $75,000. And I said, well, I appreciate that, but there's all these things that it could still need. It's not worth that, but I will give you $30,000 for the car. And I knew I wasn't really bidding against anybody, but of course, Kimmy was a very shrewd negotiator, so we met right smack dab in the middle at 30,000 bucks. So she comes over to my desk and we're kind of getting everything sorted out, but she says, you know, I'm gonna need another car. I said, okay, what would you like? She said, I'd really like a pink Bentley like the one Paris Hilton has. I said, well, they didn't make an awful lot of pink Bentleys, but we could probably buy you a Continental GT, not for 30 grand, but maybe for 50, and for 10 grand we paint or wrap it pink. You know, it's possible. And if we've got 30,000 as a down payment, we could probably get you a loan for the other half. That's fairly reasonable. Would you like to try to get a loan? She says, yes. So that meant that we got to talk about Kimmy's credit. And fortunately, she had her social security card with her at all times. She pulls it out, I write all the information down, get her driver's license, and we get to talk about where she works. She gives me the name of some pornography company, and I noticed her address was kind of at a peculiar place in town, and I Googled it, and it was actually a local spa, and I confirmed that with her. She said, yes, that's my official address. And then we got to talk about her income, and I said, how much do you make? And she kind of shook her head, and I was like, well, is that because you don't file a tax return or you don't report it all? And she said, I don't do any of that stuff. I said, well, okay. And so she kind of estimated, and she said, it really varies. I said, oh, I'm sure it does. And we came up with a number that was kind of very fair to justify the loan that she would need. And I took everything into my finance guy's office, and he immediately entered it in and then just threw it back at me, said, you got it wrong. I said, no, I'm quite sure I didn't. He said, well, if that's the case, then this girl doesn't have a credit score, has never had a library card, a cell phone in her name, a bill, anything. No one has ever trusted her to repay them $1. And we didn't have any banks that were going to become the first to do so. So I had to go back with the bad news to Kimmy and say, I'm sorry, but we do not have a way to get you a loan for your Bentley. So you and Paris Hilton will not be moving along the road in the same way tomorrow. But she was a little bit disappointed, but just said, okay, you can just pay me for the Lamborghini. So I went back to my accounting controller's office and got a check cut for $30,000 for the car. And I handed it to her. And as a, generally a glorified used car salesman, I got looked at as though I was being dishonest to people fairly often, even if it weren't the case. But in that case, she looked at me with such a lack of trust. I've never seen it in another human. And I handed her this check and she says, what am I supposed to do with that? And I said, well, it's a check. You could deposit it into your bank account, or, you could take it to our bank and they'll give you money. And she had never held a check in her life. The girl's in her early 20s. And I said, well, I promise you it's like money. She said, well, could you just give me money? And she said, well, we don't have that much cash. So she took it extremely reluctantly and went on her way. So I spent the next few weeks fixing up the car. We got it running and I drove it for about a year, almost daily. In fact, I ended up selling a Mercedes that I had been daily driving. I was just very pleased to have this, low budget Lamborghini Gallardo that I could drive as much as I wanted. Had a ton of fun, took it on some great road trips, took it to shows, just had a blast. I loved the car. But the problem was, Kimmy had told me during this negotiation that she had a second key for it. And obviously it wasn't with it when it was towed in. And not to judge, but I wasn't entirely comfortable with someone in her profession having a second key to my car. And so I kept kind of pinging her, calling her, texting her, asking her, like, can you bring me that second key? And I wasn't getting any response. A few months later, kind of just out of the blue, I got a text from her and it said, tomorrow's my birthday. Do you still want that second key? I said, well, I don't understand what those two things could have to do with each other, but yes, I do still want the second key. And the immediate text that was queued up was, can I get $100 for it? And I said, well, I'm the only person that has any legal right to this key, but yes, you can extort another $100 from me. I'll be happy to pay you that. But you have to have it here by 5 p.m. today, because I didn't want this just hanging out there. If I'm going to pay for it, then bring it on. So, of course, 5 o'clock comes and goes, and I don't see Kimmy. The next day, we close at about 7 o'clock. At about 6:50, Kimmy comes in. And the best way for me to describe what Kimmy was wearing is that it was a basketball net. It was literally more holes than white fabric. Nothing at all left up to the imagination. So she walks in out of a rainy day, and there's a woman with a young child at our parts counter buying something, I don't know. She drops whatever she had on the counter, grabs her child, and runs out of the building screaming after seeing what Kimmy was wearing. Kimmy was kind of oblivious to this, and she comes over, and I said, Kimmy, what are you all dressed up for? And she said, it's my birthday. And I said, well, you're halfway to that outfit, but I don't think she understood what I meant. And she comes up and gives me a great big hug. Kimmy loves to hug. And we sit down at my desk. She's got the key. Of course, the battery's dead. I try to open it from my desk. I have to walk out and make sure it works. I come back. It works. I give Kimmy her $100. And, given her attire and kind of the extent of our relationship at that point, I've kind of felt like certain questions were not necessarily off limits. And so I said to her, Kimmy, do you have butt implants? And she was excited, really proud to answer. I guess she'd put a lot of energy or money or whatever into the achievement there. And she said, no, I don't. I had a fat redistribution. I said, Kimmy, would you tell me more about that? She said, yes. She said, they made me gain 30 pounds. And then they liposuctioned it all out here. And then they injected it right here. She pointed to the scar. There wasn't obviously anything covering it. And they must have used something between like a turkey baster and a jackhammer to insert it back in there. And I said, well, Kimmy, does it feel peculiar? Is it strange? No, it's just there. Like when you sit on it, no, it's just part of me now. And I said, well, that is absolutely fascinating. And so Kimmy went on to celebrate her birthday in whatever way she saw fit, and I went on to drive my Gallardo. Obviously, we had thoroughly disinfected it. There was a lot of glitter to vacuum up and some exotic smells to mitigate. And of course, after that, Kimmy followed me on many social media platforms, and she was banned from a lot of them, but she was able to comment on my Instagram. And she was particularly fond of pictures of my large albino snake for some reason. And my wife would notice these things and say, who's this Kimmy girl? And I was like, don't click on the profile, and just don't worry about about her, but she is where the Lamborghini came from. And we released the first copy of this story about a year and a half ago, and a popular request is, can we have Kimmy on here to tell her side of the story? And unfortunately, she is indisposed on another period of confinement for professional reasons for the next 10 to 20 years, so we can't have that happen. But she's a very fascinating girl, and I wish her all the best, and I was very pleased to have met the recipient of such a pioneering medical procedure. I'd be a whole lot better if you hadn't made me into a fugitive from justice. When you spend a lot of time driving cars that go really fast, there's always this curiosity of what would happen if a cop actually saw me doing this. Am I going to be pulled from the car and beaten? Am I going to get arrested? Am I going to get a ticket I can't get out of? Am I never going to be able to get insurance again? I mean, certainly we've heard stories from anywhere, including this channel, of what happens when you get a terrible speeding ticket. But at the same time, in the US, there's a lot of variation. It's not like it is in a lot of European cities where there's just traffic cameras and speed cameras, and if you do this, that happens. It's not a one-to-one correlation, so it's always a little bit of an unknown. And I used to speed a lot more than I do now. I'm not saying it's a responsible thing to do, but if you do want to go fast in a fairly reasonable way on a public road, rallies can be a really good way to do that, because you're kind of insulated from some of the risk. Either you're in the back and the people in the front kind of take the brunt of whatever police attention's out there, or you're in the front and whatever you stir up might just impact the people that are behind you. And in either case, you've got some plausible deniability to say you're not the one that they're looking for. So if you want to get out there and see what your car can do, usually there are some opportunities in these kind of events to do that. And so about a month and a half ago, I was doing the Lux Rally event from Nashville to Las Vegas. And I was excited. It was kind of a long rally, 9 days. My wife was going to come with me for the first half, and a friend of mine, Tom Park, was going to come in and pick it up from Dallas. And so we got into Nashville, and they do a great job. It's a perfect food, dining experience. Everything's perfectly organized. It's kind of just an arrive, drive, and have fun kind of program. So we were really excited. My wife was excited to be going. We were driving the 430 Scuderia that I had bought because the Lamborghini didn't have air conditioning, and because most of my cars are, about half the time not working in their entirety. So I was excited to take the Ferrari out, even though it wasn't the most comfortable Grand Tourer for a trip like this, but it was going to be a lot of fun. And the first day went great. We led the pack. So we arrive in Memphis, we have a great dinner, we stay at a great hotel, everything's very perfectly organized, and we head out the next morning towards Dallas. So we're out in front in a 3-car pack, and it's me and the Scud, a Porsche 911, and a Ferrari 599, and we're keeping a pretty good pace. But the thing about these rallies is, even though there's the perception from most of the people involved that everybody's constantly going these insane speeds, usually at the front, if you maintain a pace of about 90 or 100 and don't slow down, generally you're going to stay out in front of the people who kind of get bunched up or caught as people are making passing maneuvers or whatever the case may be, and then they need to go 130, 150 periodically to be able to keep their average at the same pace. I mean, very rarely is true exotic car rally pace that much even in the vicinity of Cannonball pace. And so no big deal. I had done exactly the same thing on their Miami to Mardi Gras event a few months earlier, and just generally driven 90, 100 miles an hour out in front, and had no issues, and everybody else is having a fun time kind of playing in the background. It was a great time. And so I'm doing the same thing in this Ferrari, and we're out in front, we're using walkie-talkies to communicate, and I've got a Valentine one, and I'm running Waze. That's all I had time to set up in this car since I bought it the day before the event, but that's usually enough for me to make pretty good time along a road trip. And you're seeing a lot of noise on the V1, but that just kind of happens now. It's a very noisy kind of spectrum of radio frequencies that radar use, and some of the newer devices reduce the number of false positives and things that you'll see, but regardless, it tends to work for me. I've been using it for 15 years. And so I see some stuff, and I see one signal that probably indicates that there's a cop pretty close. And at about that same time, Jovian, who's 2 cars back in the 599, says, "Hey guys, I think we just passed a cop going in the other direction." Now at that moment, that's not a huge bother. We're on a divided highway, 2 lanes in either direction, and there's kind of a median divider with cords and like guardrails in the middle, so he can't just spin around and come after us. So the only 2 options really are Do we go insanely fast to try to get away from whatever the threat might be? Or do we just drive a little bit more prudently for the next few miles and see if he's alerted anybody up ahead? And so that's kind of what we do. On a rally, that's usually the best bet. You just kind of slow down, let everybody else catch up, and then you might start again in a few miles. So we do that, but right around the next bend, we see a Charger on the side of the road, and it's a police car. And he's right at the entrance to a rest area, and as he sees us, he pulls out in front of us and turns his lights on. At this point, we're going maybe high 80s, low 90s, worth some attention, but nothing alarming. It shouldn't be to him. And so all three of us obediently and immediately acquiesce. We pull over on the side of the road, and normal protocol for getting pulled over: turn the car off, keys on top of the dash, windows down, hands on the steering wheel. Just don't reach for anything, don't do anything that might alarm him. But from there, things escalated rather quickly, because this cop kicks his door open and jumps out of his car, gun drawn. And I'm like, whoa, 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 hands on top of the steering wheel at this point. And he's like, get out of the car. I'm like, whoa, whoa, okay. I'm unbuckling this hand here. And then and at this point, he's already pulling on my door handle, which doesn't unlock until I pull the inside handle. At that point, he pulls the door open, pulls me out of the car, and immediately handcuffs me. Now, keep in mind, my wife is in the passenger seat, and she's like, what's going on? I'm like, it's gonna be all right, just relax. He goes, get behind my car, goes to Matt in the Porsche behind me, handcuffs him with his spare set of handcuffs, goes back to his car, gets an extra set of handcuffs, and goes back and handcuffs Jovian. So we're all standing kind of around behind his car, and at this point the rest of the cars are kind of coming by. So about half the field went by us at a very low speed, noticing that we were all there, and the other half kind of snuck into the rest area so they could look through the trees to see what was going on, and I guess be there in case they needed to get our cars, because it didn't look like things were going all that well. And so he never says that we're under arrest, never reads us our rights, just immediately starts kind of detaining us and restraining us and just asking, what are y'all doing? And I'm like, okay, sir, sorry about this. We're just driving to Dallas with some friends. We got all these stickers. You can see it's at an event. We just left from Memphis. We're in Nashville the day before. We're not trying to hurt anybody or do anything crazy. And he's like, well, you just passed a state trooper going 111 miles an hour. Well, if you say so, but I really don't think we were going that fast. And, certainly we're not trying to. I mean, I understand that, that would be totally unacceptable, but also trust me that the car's going an awful lot faster than that. So if we'd been trying to go fast, it would have been a whole lot more than 111. And I've had actually pretty good success with that line. It tends to kind of lighten the mood a little bit. But he's just heavy breathing, like super amped up. And you could tell that he had just gotten a radio call from this guy saying there's 3 exotic cars coming your way. You're just about to have a high-speed chase. And he was a young cop, and probably was really excited and adrenaline pumping, everything in this emotional high at what was about to happen. And then anticlimactically, we all just kind of pull over and are perfectly obedient. Now, your best strategy in any pullover, regardless of what's happening, is keep the cop talking. The more he talks, the more it humanizes you, the more he gets reassured that you're not out here as some menace to society, and it just ends up always resulting in a better outcome. Now, at this point, the cop that we'd passed has gone to an exit, circled back, and he pulls up behind us, and a couple other police cars are showing up as well, including one older cop that's in like this paratrooper uniform, this like full dark green army. Look at I don't know what it was. And he starts spouting off, hey, look at all these cool cars. Like, it's like an old cannonball. I mean, I remember these days and all this stuff, and talking about his cars and how fast he drives and all the fun he has. So I'm like, okay, we're at least moving in the right direction. But of course, we're still handcuffed here. And, of course, if you're being restrained by a cop, you can always ask them, am I under arrest? And if not, they're supposed to let you go, either with a ticket or whatever. In this circumstance, we weren't going to do that, because I think the answer in that circumstance would have been, oh yeah, you are, and then let me read you your rights and throw you in the back of my car. So we're all just kind of talking. I explain that we do this sort of drive sometimes for charity, talk about the Cannonball Memorial Run, raising money for the families of fallen officers, and talk about our itinerary a bit, that we're just out having fun and enjoying some good cars. And most cops are car guys. We've seen and talked about that a lot here. And so when you start talking about cars, in most cases, they're ready to reciprocate that. I think he had some kind of a Mustang or something like that. And, it was all getting more and more friendly, and I can see his heart rate and respiratory rate dropping as we continue talking. Of course, course, Jovi and Matt don't really say much of anything. They're just kind of wide-eyed, not sure what's going on. And I do most of the talking. And so I'm still handcuffed and I'm leaning in his car. He's typing in all of our informations. He's taken our wallets out of our back pockets or wherever they were and has gotten everything. And it's very awkward and strange, but we're just kind of along for the ride at this point. And if he's finding out if there's any warrants or crazy tickets or anything that he needs to be worried about. And of course, there's no issues there. Everybody's insurance is valid. No alarm bells going off. And I'm talking to him and, just giving him some insight about the cars and what we do and all this stuff. And just whatever I can say to keep him talking. And eventually he's like, all right, guys, I should take you to jail, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to give you the tickets. It'll be for the 111 for each of you and a reckless driving charge. And I'm like, man, we were kind of all by ourselves. Like, can it not be a reckless driving charge? Because in some states, if you're over a certain speed, they have to call it reckless driving. It's like by definition, over whatever 100 is reckless driving. But Arkansas is not one of those states. And so I'm like, all right, well, I can't talk him out of it. My shrewdest of negotiations were unsuccessful. We didn't meet right smack dab in the middle at a warning and a handshake. And so it takes a little while, probably 30, 45 minutes, and the girls are all freaking out as to what's going on, but everything gets calm. Megan snaps a few pictures, and eventually we're all happy and having fun. They let us out, me and Matt, out of the handcuffs. They couldn't find the key to Jovian's for a little while, so he hung out in handcuffs for a little while longer than the rest of us. But eventually they do just give us these tickets. They tell us we're going to be able to pay them online. We don't have to appear or anything, and we can just go on our way. And so that's exactly what we did. Obviously, it kind of tempered the pace a little bit for the next little while, but eventually we got into Dallas. And the first thing that I did was called the Ticket Clinic, because a few days before leaving on this trip, I had closed a sponsorship for Ticket Clinic to be our monthly presenting sponsor for the month of September. So eventually you'll start to see their ads, but I had told him when I signed him up, I said, hopefully I don't require your services in the next couple of weeks, because I am about to do this rally across the country and back. And what they are is a company that helps you locate a local attorney in whatever jurisdiction where you get a ticket, because you always want a local attorney with a chance that they go and play golf with the judge every Thursday, and they'll usually have a better outcome and just a friendlier negotiation than if you have a local lawyer show up. And regardless of that, you never want to just show up yourself and try to argue it, because if they see you and make you answer for whatever you did, they're just going to throw the book at you. And even if you have a license in a state where there's no reciprocity, you really don't want to pay a ticket going 111 miles an hour or a reckless driving charge, because at the end of the day, it's just going to keep you from getting insurance. Unfortunately, the only issue that's ever kept me from getting insurance was big diminished value claims in the past that weren't my fault, and some really expensive cars. And so sometimes insurance doesn't like that. So everything like that was fine, but I really did not want this to play out as a full conviction. So the guys at Ticket Clinic found me a couple different lawyers in Arkansas and got me in touch with the one they recommended as being the best, and I started talking to him. And very immediately he was like, man, this is kind of a bigger deal than I think even you understand. Apparently, they've gotten a lot harsher on speeding. Arkansas was historically pretty lenient, but now a reckless driving charge apparently carried a minimum sentence of 5 days in jail. And I'm like, so you're telling me I'm going to have to go back to Arkansas to go to jail for 5 days? He's like, well, maybe. I mean, I'd like to think we can get it knocked down to like a lesser fine or a lesser circumstance, a lesser speed, and not have the reckless on there. But at this point, yeah, that's what I expect to have happen. And he said, also, there's no way they're going to let you just pay this thing online. Like that, you can't pay the fee for a crime. Reckless driving is a criminal charge, not just a citation or a fine for speeding. So he's like, that's not how this is going to go. But about 10 days later, it did show up. And at that point, he had been like, well, I'm going to enter a not guilty plea remotely, so we don't have to show up, and then they'll assign us a trial date, tell me what the prosecutor is, and then I'll start negotiating. But he's like, he was going to be surprised if it showed up, and when it did, he was very surprised. And one of the guys had a Pennsylvania license. He just felt like paying it. He's like, I'm not going to worry about this. It won't come back on points, and his insurance is already very expensive, so he wasn't bothered by it. The other guy got a different attorney, and so we were both going to see what we could have happen. And in most cases, the hope is that you can kind of move it to like a non-points violation or a lower speed that doesn't transfer, whatever. In general, if you spend the money on hiring a lawyer, pumping some money into the local economy, and you're willing to pay some fines, usually they'll play ball. And so the trial date was coming up. It came and went, and he had said that he had submitted everything, so I was just like, all right, whatever. But a couple days later, I decided, you know what, I'm going to check their little online system and see what it says now. and it says failure to appear, conviction of the misdemeanor class C or D or whatever it was for reckless driving. And I'm like, whoa, what the heck? And so I screenshot it, send it to him, and he's, furious. He's like, I sent it, I've got proof, all this stuff, it'll be okay. And I'm like, well, figure it out, dude. Like, this is not acceptable, and it's probably gonna reduce our leverage for negotiation moving forward, so let's see what happens. He tells me that he's on it and that everything's going to be okay, and eventually shoots me a text, says, your license isn't suspended. I'm like, well, that's good to know. And he's like, I'm working on the rest. And so he calls me back a couple days later. He said, how you doing? I'm like, well, I'd be a whole lot better if you hadn't made me into a fugitive from justice. But he said, no, you're all right. Everything's going to be fine. I've got it knocked down. Here's your new court date, and I'll either have to go down there and appear, or hopefully we can just work it out between now and then. And so that date was a couple of days ago, and he called me afterwards. He said, all right, I was able to talk to him, and I got it down to negligent operation. And I was like, well, I don't even know what that means. He said, well, it's a county ordinance violation, so it's not really even like a highway moving violation. There's no points, it doesn't transfer. Carries the same fine. Coincidentally, they're still going to get their money, but at the end of the day, it doesn't go on my driving record. No insurance will know about it. Other than this video, nobody will ever really hear another word about it. And so that's why you do these things. I mean, obviously I had to pay something for the attorney, but it paled in comparison to the increase in insurance premiums that I would have enjoyed over the coming years if I had something like that on my driving record. So I guess all's well that ends well, or at least ends okay, and we enjoyed the rest of the rally, had an absolute blast. Of course, Ticket Clinic got another very, very satisfied customer, and I was pleased to have had them available for something like this, and managed not to get into too much more trouble, but we did get pulled over 3 more times, and they involved some a little bit more successful but shrewd negotiation, and one of them was an interesting story, and we'll just have to save that for another day. In a pawn shop with a strange lien and a weird buyback clause. So we've all got our weaknesses, and one of mine is Bentleys. And over the years, I've tried to buy dozens of these cars, and I'm actually kind of proud of myself to say that I haven't bought any of them, because Bentleys, initially they occupy a pretty high price point, then they don't depreciate all that much for a couple of years, and then they have the catastrophic traditional depreciation that's inherent to all luxury cars. But if I'm gonna spend as much money as they are new, I'm gonna end up buying a Ferrari or a Lamborghini. But when I wait, I start to get scared, like anybody else would, of the impending maintenance liabilities. And so I've looked at them, and I've come dangerously close to owning a bunch of them. I remember one was a Flying Spur Speed that had been in an annual accident for 4 or 5 consecutive years. Like almost to the day, this previous owner would crash it in some way. And it had been repaired pretty well, but for whatever reason, I didn't end up buying it. But the most interesting one that I ever came across was a 2004 Bentley Arnage T. And those late 03, 04 Arnages are just the quintessential perfection of British Bentleys, because after that you started to have the interference and kind of the meddling of Volkswagen as they tried to make them more reliable, and they brought in the GT cars, and it was, it's great for the brand, but it wasn't as pure and essentially British as these cars were. You had the 4-inch thick wool carpets and the rich leather and just that smell and everything about them that was so Bentley. So when I see one of those, I'm always hooked, but I've managed to avoid it, but this is about as close as I've ever gotten. So I found this listing on Craigslist, my favorite pastime to look for strange and interesting and untoward exotic cars. And this car was an 04 Arnage T here in Atlanta. And I recognized it because we'd actually had it for sale on consignment a couple years prior at Motor Cars of Georgia while I'd worked there. We hadn't sold it then because the guy wanted it on consignment like $90,000, and the car wasn't worth that then. And at this point that I was looking for it, a couple years ago, it was probably worth 55 to 60 grand, but the asking price in the ad was $35,000. And so I was kind of intrigued because it was cheap, but not so cheap that it seemed too good to be true. And Bentleys, as they age, are hard to sell. So I was kind of excited at this prospect that I might, have a good shot at this car. So I contacted the owner and asked him what the story was. And he gave me a little bit of information, but he really knew very little about the car. He hadn't really serviced it and had no idea what had happened to it before. But he said at the moment, everything was sort of functional. But he went on to tell me that there was a little bit of a strange financial situation with the car. No surprise there, it's Craigslist and it's cars that I'm looking at, so this stuff happens. But he told me that he had recently got a title pawn loan on the car. So he had given the title to a local pawn shop, and they had given him a loan on it. You know, a reasonably common practice on $2,000 cars, but not really on Bentleys. But what he told me was that he wanted someone to go and buy the car from the pawn shop and give him another 90 days to buy it back. So he said, I'll let you buy it for a good deal because I can't buy it back right now, but I'd like the chance to buy it back from you at whatever you end up having into it. So I'm like, well, that's pretty cool. And he said he would give me, any registration fees and further cost or maintenance that I had to spend. So I'm like, the worst case scenario here is that I own this Bentley for free for about 3 months. And the best case scenario is I get a good deal on this car, drive it a couple of years and sell it like I normally would. So I said, sure, let me go take a look at it. So he had arranged with this pawn shop for someone to come and look at the car for him. And it got kind of strange, but I showed up and they said, yeah, well, Mr. Bolian, we're happy to show you the car. And the woman who was working there actually took me to a nearby public storage building. They hadn't stored the car in their local sort of lot. They'd put it somewhere, I guess, a little bit more safe because it probably cost as much as all the other cars they had there. So we went over there and obviously the battery was dead, but I'd brought a jump box. And so we got the car started and I sort of drove it around the block of storage buildings. And it was okay, it needed a little bit, there were a couple lights on, but kind of what you'd expect from an older Bentley that had been sitting for a little while. So I thanked her and left the car there and said, let me go make some calls and I'll call you back with an offer. But first I talked to the owner and I said, it's really not in the perfect shape you told me it is. It needs some things, but I really think the car's worth about 20 grand and I don't think they're gonna take that. But maybe 22, 23. And he said, well, that's actually what they gave me for it. So it's always nice to have it reinforced that you're lowballing properly, because if I want to pay what a pawn shop's going to pay, then I'm usually pretty safe in a car. But I went on to say, all right, well, let me think about how much more it's worth to me. And I really like these types of deals because part of being a shrewd negotiator is not in necessarily the exchange, but it's in the circumstance. It's in setting yourself up to have the fewest competitors as possible when it comes to buying a car. So when you have circumstances like an old Bentley in a pawn shop with a strange lien and a weird buyback clause and all these other things that really don't have anything to do with the car, they devalue it immediately, but over time that story doesn't matter anymore. So once I owned this thing, I would just be selling any old Bentley, not one out of a pawn shop that I might have to give back to this guy months later. So that type of circumstance tends to be a great way to buy a car if you come across the right opportunity at the right time. So what I told him was, all right, let me think about it. And I ended up saying, what, I think it's worth 25 grand. Let me call him. And he had said that with all the fees and with all the interest, he technically owed them 28. But I knew they might not think they'd get all that. So I said, all right, let me see if they'll do 25. So I called the owner of the pawn shop and I said, hey, I'll give you 25 grand for the car. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. And I said, all right, well, that's okay. So I kind of left it there, but a couple days went by and I said, you know what, I'm not going to lose the car over 3 grand. I called him back, I said, you know what, 28's fine. I'll come in and I'll bring you a check, whatever you want, and I'll buy the car. And he said, you know what, Ed, I appreciate that, but we're just not going to worry about it. This has gotten too muddy. He was technically past the point where he was supposed to be able to buy it back, so we're just going to send it down to a Florida dealer and they're going to deal with it. I said, okay, whatever. Here's another Bentley that I somehow avoided owning. Fantastic. So a couple of years go by, I truly think nothing else of it, but I get a call from some ambulance chasing personal injury attorney. And he says, are you Ed Bolian? I said, yes, I am. He said, did you try to buy a Bentley off Craigslist a couple of years ago? I said, that could have happened. He kind of gave me some more details and I said, yep, that absolutely did. I remember trying to buy that car and they wouldn't let me at the pawn shop, so I really never worried about it again. He said, well, my client has filed a lawsuit against that pawn shop saying that they should have sold you the car because they had told him they would and that he was damaged through this process. I'm like, well, that's kind of weird. I said, what do you mean he was damaged? He couldn't buy it. He said, well, he's saying that since you were willing to buy it and willing to let him buy it back, he missed out on the true value of the car. I said, all right, sure, whatever you need me to do. He said, well, we'll probably need a deposition at some point, and if it goes to trial, we might need you as a witness. I said, well, that sounds like fun. Count me in. Months go by, I hear nothing, but then I get a call from a lawyer representing the title pawn company. Okay? He says, well, we're still kind of wrapped up in this lawsuit, and I just want to kind of get an affidavit of exactly what happened in your own words. And I kind of walked him through what it was. He said, all right, well, I'm going to make some notes and I'll send something out to you. So he sent me some paperwork and said, if this is what you recall happening, sign it. It was, so I did. But in the process of talking to the pawn shop's attorney, I was like, look, this seems like a really weird lawsuit. what did y'all end up getting for the car? And he said, we sold it for about 31 grand after some reconditioning and stuff like that. And I'm like, well, I'm sure you've offered him the $3,000 between the 28 and the 31. And they're like, oh yeah, we've offered him more than that, but he's going after these crazy punitive damages. I said, that's weird, I don't really understand that. So when I talked to the previous owner's attorney, I was like, forgive me for prying, but are you doing this on a contingency basis, or is he paying you for this legal work? And he said, no, it's a contingency basis, which was obviously kind of common in that legal world. And I said, well, can you just explain to me how you're justifying the damages? And I said, well, in order for him to be damaged, he had to come into the ability to buy the car from me within 90 days of when we were trying to buy it. So how are you proving that with like bank statements or paychecks or liquidity or something like that? And he said, well, I don't think I could prove that. I said, well, then you don't have a case. If you can't prove that he was able to buy it back, you can't prove he was damaged. And he goes, did you tell their lawyer that? I said, no, I didn't tell their lawyer that. But they're lawyers, they understand this kind of thing, and they know what damages mean. They want to settle it clearly because they don't want to keep spending time and money on this process. He's like, all right, well, I'll start working on that. So a few months go by and I get a subpoena in the mail, and they've gotten a date on a trial calendar for some local court, and they were coming up and they needed me to testify because essentially their whole case rested on my willingness to buy this thing and then sell it back to the guy a few months later. And they tell me that I've got like a 5-hour call, so they're gonna let me know when I need to show up. So days go by that week and I never get called, and it turns out they were a low priority that never got heard. So I talked to the lawyer on the customer side, and he just kind of said, well, we're kind of back to the drawing board. We'll keep going until we can get another trial date in a few months. And obviously I've never heard from him. I don't know what'll happen. Probably a whole lot of nothing, but it just goes to show you that sometimes the most interesting stories are not about the cars you actually get to buy, it's the ones that you don't. My boss comes across and walks me into his office and says, Ed, don't try to sell him any more cars today. When you sell someone an exotic car, usually something they've thought about or dreamt about or shopped for a great deal of time, it's usually a great experience. But that's not always the case. And if you shop for a car remotely on the internet or by phone and you take delivery by having it shipped to you, technically you have 3 days to refuse it. But if you come to the dealership, negotiate a deal in person, pay for the car, and then drive it away, it's yours at that point. You don't get to bring it back. But as you'd imagine, selling hundreds of cars a year, sometimes people would like to. And I remember one guy in particular, because he had rented the yellow Gallardo that I had for supercar rentals. And he had driven it around for the weekend and loved it, and showed me at the time the Lotus Esprit that was in his garage that he never drove and meticulously detailed. And as he came into the dealership a few years later, he said that he had sold the Lotus, but he wanted another sports car. And so we started looking around, and he really had his eye on an Aston Martin Vantage, but he wanted a stick. And at the time, probably 2012, they were starting to become more and more rare. But we had one that was gorgeous, had every carbon option and all the updates for 2012 and on. We reached something that was agreeable, but the whole deal took a long time. And in fact, we didn't really finish up everything and have him signed and financed and all the paperwork done until after we would have normally closed at about 6 o'clock. And at that point, it had kind of gotten dark. And so he drove off to head home and was actually really kind of nervous about it because he never wanted the car to have any imperfections. And you'd imagine driving at 40, 50 miles to his house, it was going to have the chance of something like that happening. But we said, you know what, just keep some distance, drive slow, you'll be fine. And we're closed the next day on Sunday, but the first thing on Monday, that Vantage comes rolling right back in. He had kind of wrapped it with like a temporary style clear bra to protect it as he would drive it back. And as he got out of the car, he had a big piece of paper. On it was a handwritten list of every single imperfection in this brand new car that he had just bought. And he was furious about it. And as I went through kind of the things that he was upset about, they were all really the product of it being a hand-built Aston Martin. Because while Astons are unbelievably high-quality cars with quality materials that are built by people who are meticulous, they're hand-built. So it's not a stamped-out Japanese or American car that comes off an assembly line every 17 seconds. And obviously his first request was, just give me my money back, take the car back, and we'll think about something on another day. And we were not going to do that. We weren't going to give him his money back and unwind a deal and not have the profit that we had in it. So over the course of the day, he's just distraught, going back and forth. I ended up taking him to lunch, just kind of trying to talk him off the ledge and love the car that he loved 48 hours prior to that. and it really just was not working. So as we got back, I said, you know what, look, maybe the one that you bought is a little bit below average. I'm not sure that's the case, but let's look at some other cars and just see if maybe you want to trade into something else. I mean, certainly there's been some depreciation because we'll have to title the car, we've punched the warranty and everything else has started on it, but let's see what we could do to maybe move you into another one. And we had a very similarly spec'd black on black Vantage S. And so we ended up taking that out of a test drive just to let him see, would you prefer the paddle shift? And he did kind of like that and thought, well, maybe this car that was developed a little bit later somehow is in higher quality or better condition. And there was no good way to expect that, but we let him look around. We kind of said, look, just make sure that you're comfortable with it. But again, the whole negotiation and trying to figure out the trade value of a 2-day-old car on another new car that we certainly did want to sell took a good while. And so that went into the night again after we would normally have closed, but he agreed to buy it. He paid for the difference, and then we just kind of did a collateral swap on his loan, I think, and he drives off into the night. But as you'd expect, the next morning he comes back and he spent all night with his bright lights in his garage finding every single imperfection in the car. Every panel gap that's slightly different side to side, or trim piece that's a little bit misaligned, or little speck in the paint, whatever he finds, he's just livid again. And so, as you'd expect, I move him to another car. Let's look around this one, see if it's any better. Maybe it'll live up to your expectation. We'll do what we did yesterday and let you write us a little bit of a check and have a different one. And as we were walking around the showroom looking at other cars, trying to find out the most perfect one of the bunch, my boss comes across and walks me into his office and says, Ed, don't try to sell him any more cars today. Whatever ends up happening, which will not involve us giving his money back and unwinding these two deals, let's make it only involve these two cars rather than another one. And at some point, you just kind of have to, look, go drive your car, enjoy it. When you bring it back and trade it back to us on whatever you decide you want next, we're still going to give you all the money anyone will, because it's going to be above our standards. We want to be respectful of your own, but at the end of the day, it's a hand-built exotic car that's built in very low quantities. And we ended up finding out that about a week later, he traded it in on a gray Maserati. Brand new from a dealer down the street, and you know, all the power to him. I cannot imagine that any Maserati was going to be a better quality car, other than by random happenstance, than this Vantage was. But I know that they ended up running that Vantage through the auction, and I would imagine the reason he did that is they were the only people who had enough spread on their new car to allow him enough to make him reasonably content with the deal he got on the trade value. But perhaps the most interesting story I have about immediate buyer's regret was also a different gray Maserati. But there was a guy who had been coming around for the last few months kind of looking for his next sports car. And he mentioned that he had had a Maserati Grand Sport, an 05 or 06 Cambia Corsa car, and he loved it, which was kind of a unique sentiment for a Grand Sport or any Maserati of that vintage. But we ended up getting in on consignment a 2005 Maserati Spider Cambia Corsa paddle shift car, and it was pretty nice. I mean, it's one of those things you get kind of nervous about selling because there was a pretty good chance something bad was going to happen not long after he buys it, because it's a pretty good chance something's going to happen every day you go out and drive a Maserati. I think he was probably a, I don't know, early 50s Italian guy, lived in Atlanta for a long time, and was really excited. It did fit what he was looking for, so it didn't take long. He agreed to everything. We got it all set up, signed the paperwork, and I pulled the car around after we had it kind of cleaned up and ready to go. We walked through all the things and kind of just left him there to leave in the car. So I went back inside and was doing something at my desk, and I see him kind of pull around to a different part of the parking lot and park in front of a different door and walk inside, and he wanted to ask something about his temp tag or something else. And the slant in our parking lot was not very steep, but it was slight, and certainly if you put a car in neutral and didn't engage the parking brake, which is precisely what he had done, it might roll backwards. And it rolled backwards about 20 feet into a parked Jaguar that we had on the front line in inventory ready to sell. So he comes in just freaking out after he's gone out and observed the damage and seen that there's some scratches and, you know, a little bit of a dent on each of the cars. And it wasn't going to be that major, but obviously the idea of having to repaint part of your new-to-you Italian sports car is not something that makes you wildly pleased. So he's like, I don't know, I shouldn't leave it in today. I can't do this, and you need to take it back. It's your car that y'all let get damaged. And we're like, no, I mean, you parked it in a way that allowed it to damage the car. We're not that upset. We'd like you not to be upset. And as we went back and forth, we kind of like, look, we don't want to sour the relationship over this. Let's just say we'll fix ours, you fix yours. It's going to be a few $100 to repaint each bumper. Nobody's going to worry about it. We'll move on down the road. And he reluctantly, after a few hours of groveling and whining, he did leave. And again, we were closed the next day on Sunday. But first thing Monday morning, a woman walks in. Elderly woman, pretty Italian looking, tons of makeup, just a painted on face, and huge rhinestone glasses, dressed far beyond how someone normally would to come to a car dealership on a Monday morning. And she comes in and she asks if she could speak to the general manager. And it was one of those days that I was very pleased to not be the general manager. There were lots of days like that. And so I directed her to his office, and she walked right in, set herself down. And this woman was the mother of the person who had just bought the Maserati. And she had come in, I guess, to rescue her son, probably after he had whined and groveled to her about the regret he had for having become so emotional and bought this Italian sports car over the weekend. And she felt like we should just unwind everything, give his money back, and not blame him for the mistakes of his, I guess, youth in his 50s or whatever. My boss was having none of it and continued to kind of indulge her in her need to express whatever sentiment she had about our business practices of, selling cars to people who test drove them and wanted to buy them. But she did not prevail. So after probably an hour or so, she left a little bit perturbed, and throughout the afternoon she would call back several times trying to find someone who could make a decision and also give her a different answer to her question. And we all towed the company line that when you buy it, it's yours. If you do buy your next exotic car, do think about it, test drive it, and think about what it's going to be like when you wake up with it in the morning, because most of the time you love it, but sometimes you don't. But either way, it's still yours. It's sort of like having James Bond dog sit for you, or having Kimmy do your taxes. I'll never forget the first magazine article I read about the Murcielago. It was in 2001, and it was a road and track article where they had taken a press car to Nardo racetrack, and they had broken the fastest 100 miles, fastest 100 kilometers, and the furthest distance driven in a car in an hour. And I just fell in love with the car. I thought it was so dramatic, and it took everything that was awesome about a Countach and a Diablo, and it brought it into enough of a modern context that it was something that could be driven, but not so far into it that it had so much crazy technology that it wouldn't be reliable years from then. And I felt like I had to drive one, and I was 16, 17 years old at the time, and I had the habit of sort of talking car dealers into letting me test drive cars, but I couldn't get the local Atlanta dealer to let me test drive one, the dealership that I would end up working at not too long afterwards. But I ended up calling Lamborghini Carolinas, and I explained to them my business at the time, and I had started an exotic animal breeding practice. I had an albino iguana business out of my parents' basement, and it was not that profitable, but it was able to sort of weave the illusion together that I might be much wealthier than a 17-year-old ought to be. And so I convinced them that if I would come up there, that they would let me test drive one of their new cars. And so we took this gorgeous red example around and drove it all over the back roads around the dealership. And I remember the only time the salesperson told me to slow down, I think we were doing about 110 through a school zone. Now the school zone was closed, but they had a terrific relationship with the local law enforcement. In fact, the only other person I saw in the dealership that day was the local chief of police that was getting to drive whatever he wanted in whatever manner he might choose. And I, was in no position at that point to afford one, but I kind of, filed that in the back pocket and set out in my life to find a way to have the means to do so. And I started the exotic car rental company, and it wasn't really the right car for that type of fleet. And I ended up, proceeding on to work at the dealership. And not long after that, we got in an orange manual LP640. So the second generation of the Murcielago. And that was really what I wanted. It was so timeless, had the gated shifter and everything that you could love about a big dramatic sports car. And I knew long term that it would be much more reliable than the paddles, because we were already starting to see, the occasional shift actuator failure or excessive early clutch wear that you might find with an e-gear car. So I really wanted to stick. But the rule of thumb with the manufacturers had always been that about 5% of new sports cars, particularly from the Italian manufacturers, were demanded as manual transmissions. So it wasn't the lion's share of the market. It wasn't something you saw all that often. So I kind of started casually making a list of the VINs of the cars that I would see. And as I was adding them up and calling people and sort of searching classifieds and databases, I only wound up finding 26 cars. And as I was doing that, I started to develop these relationships, both with the owners, but also with the people who wanted to buy them. And they were starting to recognize, particularly around early 2014 that these cars were a lot more rare than people gave them credit for. I got a call from a friend of a friend, and that mutual friend we had a manual LP640. He said, I know Ed's looking for these cars, kind of keeping tabs on them. Why don't you call him and he'll find you one to buy? Because this guy had decided this was his dream car and he wanted to pay really whatever it took to get a nice one at that point. And this was right after Nicolas Cage's old car, a balloon white car that I had sold about 2011, had sold again for 329 grand. So it was kind of a new market setting price, but people weren't sure if they should attribute it to his celebrity status or the fact that the car was so rare. And early in 2014 at the Amelia Island RM auction, someone had paid way more than anyone imagined was possible for a manual 599, and the reason they did so is because the ad had stated that there were only 19 ever brought to the US. Now in fact there were about 30 that we've got on VINwiki now, but they're plenty rare, much more rare than any of the modern cars that we're told are rare, you know, 599 GTOs, 16Ms, Porsche 911Rs that are built in much larger quantities than anything that was rare historically. And so as I was building my list, I ended up being able to source another car because I called everybody I knew that had them and I said, look, I've got someone who's interested in paying up for one. And I ended up selling an 07 orange car to him for about 281 grand. And that was a very strong number for the time, but definitely evidence of where the market was headed. But there weren't a ton of people out there at that point recognizing them. Now at that point, I'd owned two LP640s myself. I bought an orange Roadster in 2012 and a red coupe in 2014. And so I was looking to trade into a manual car and was just kind of surveying the market that I could find. And I ended up finding a green 08 that was like the nicest example of a coupe that I could find. And I got it for 215 grand. I had sold it a year or so prior for not much more than that, but it was at a moment when I couldn't buy it myself. And so I was very pleased to get the car back from the guy and he was ready to move it. So I had my one of these 26 cars that I could identify as the LP640 coupes and roadsters for the US market. And I'd also seen how many of them had been damaged or hurt in some way and that the number was fast dwindling each year. So I called the factory to kind of verify my findings. And I said, hey, do you know how many LP640s with a stick you brought into the US? And they said, no, we have no idea. We don't keep records like that. What are you talking about? I said, well, if you go into your sales system and you type this VIN prefix, you'll be able to tell me how many VINs it puts out, and that'll be how many are in the US. And they're like, oh yeah, I guess that would work. And they're like, so what's the VIN prefix? I said, well, ZHWBU37M for the coupe and ZHWBU47M for the roadster. According to their records, there were 23 in the US. And I had already found more, but the factory has kind of a way of disavowing any knowledge of cars with a sordid past or anything like that. It was just the perfect driving experience for a hypercar, supercar that you could actually use. And as I've talked about, it really is an utterly useless car. You know, it doesn't fit anywhere, you can't see anything behind you. It's sort of like having James Bond dog sit for you or having Kimmy do your taxes. That's really not what they're for, but it would be wildly entertaining to watch them try. And so if I take this car to the grocery store or out in some crowded parking lot, it's stupid, it's worthless, and it doesn't work in that context, but it makes every driving experience an awful lot of fun. And so I loved the green car, but it was appreciating so fast because I was spreading the word of how rare these cars were, even to the point that RM referenced in selling another car my website to say how rare they were. And it was working and the values were skyrocketing, and every month or two there was a new precedent transaction of how expensive the cars were and how valuable they were. And it was legitimate because people were finding that these are so much more rare than anything else they might look at in terms of an investment exotic that they made a ton of sense to own. But there was something about having owned the perfect one that was kind of a good and bad for me because I want to be able to drive the car all the time. And as I have this perfect example of exactly the right spec, and it was the only green 640 coupe stick in the US, I got kind of worried about putting so many miles on it. So I drove it about 4,200 miles in a year, and I ended up selling it to Roy Katz at Katz Exotics. And I sold it to him for 350 grand, and he ended up selling it, I think, for 365. The reason I let it go is that I'd been contacted by the owner of another one. And I said, you know, look, I have to have one of these cars. I would just rather have one that's not as nice. You know, it's sort of like the end of Gone in 60 Seconds, where Nicolas Cage has just had this profound experience with his dream car, the 67 Shelby GT500. And he ends up obviously doing away with this perfect example, and at the close of the movie, Angelina Jolie's character gives him a really rough example that's kind of a project of his dream car. And so I found this guy, and he had one with a bit of a story. But he'd owned the car for a little while and spent a bit on maintenance, but he said, it needed a few things. He was not very good at describing the condition of the car or the car's history. And so that didn't make him much of a shrewd negotiator, as you might imagine. The car had a previous salvage or theft recovery title while it was in Canada. And it had been sold new in Canada, but then it was listed for sale around 2009. And the dealer that was representing the car had taken it out joyriding one night, drunk. What I came to understand is he had sort of spun it around and ended up on a curb, and he had broken the front wheel and broken the rear control arm. And so the car wasn't drivable, but he was trashed. And he didn't want to wait around for the cops to get a DUI, so rather than doing that, he took his dealer tag off and got a taxi home and reported the car stolen when he got into work the next morning. And so his insurance paid out for the theft, and I don't know whatever happened to him in terms of that fraud, but the car was issued a branded title in Canada. But for some reason, when it came into the US around 2013, the brand washed off. Now that doesn't tend to happen, so I'm not exactly sure how they did, but now, as I've got it in Georgia, it's got a clean Georgia title. It had a clean Florida title in Nevada when I bought it. As I placed my green car with Roy Katz, and I had made about $135,000 owning it in about a year, and fortunately, since I had financed all of it with Woodside Credit, I'd done so with really no money out of pocket. So this was all profit and all cash that I could use to buy the next car. And he had wanted 150 grand for this car in its current form, and it had some needs, and so it seemed like the perfect thing. It was my dream car that I could spend some time fixing up, but at the very least I could drive guiltlessly as many miles as I'd ever want to. Well, I agreed to buy it for 130 to 140 grand, but I'm like, we'll finalize the exact number when I get out there. And so I flew out to Vegas with a friend. It's a little worse than he's described. And I'm kind of pot committed because I've got two guys in a one-way ticket in Vegas, and I was planning to drive the car home. But the air conditioning didn't work, the check engine light was on, the airbag light was on, the seatbelt alarm was dinging constantly. It was miserably out of alignment. There were a few little cracks in the leading edges, the rockers and the bumper that he hadn't disclosed, and it was just filthy. So we take it to a car wash to really discern exactly the state of things, and I end up having to obviously talk him down a bit on it, and I ended up buying the car for 120 grand. So I've made 135 on the green car, and I buy the gray one for 120. So this is my dream Lamborghini that I'm able to get for free just by curating the history of all these cars, because there were the 26 US cars, and this was one of 5 Canadian cars. It was also one in Mexico. But I've now got one, and this is the first Lamborghini that I've ever been able to own without a gigantic loan on it, and I'm just on cloud 9. I take it to Lamborghini Las Vegas, we get the seatbelt dinging to stop, get the air conditioning recharged, which becomes generally sufficient for the drive home, and we get it aligned so it'll at least go straight. And so we finally get the car home. It's about 2,300 miles from Vegas to Atlanta, and we just have a blast, get to see the country and really experience it in a different way than we had on the Cannonball record runs. But it was not perfect, it had blemishes everywhere, but it was perfect for me because it was just a great driver car. The same way that the prostitute Gallardo was one that you could just own and drive guiltlessly, that was this in the context of my dream manual LP640. And so over the next few months, I got everything cleaned up and made it just a great driver example. I've had it about a year now, and I've driven it about 9,000 miles on it. But I just love it. At the moment, the CL's down for suspension issues, the 2904 S-Class is down. I just sold the limo. So it's the only registered car I have that runs. So I've been daily driving it for a couple of months now and loving every second of it. I mean, certainly it's a caricature of what a car ought to be or do, but I just love it. And as much as I have that car guy itch to trade for something new every day of my life, I just can't find something that I think I'm going to enjoy more, particularly when you couple it with the fact that the car's paid for, it's not depreciating, it's actually appreciating. I think today the cheapest one that's on the market is $309, and certainly it's a nicer car than mine, but I love having the worst example of the coolest car I could ever want. And so I'm having a blast and daily driving my dream car and not worrying about a thing. will you bring the Lamborghini and just come pick me up around the corner at the Waffle House? So about 4 years ago, I got a call from a few guys in Tennessee who had gathered up some seed capital from some family members, and they wanted to start an exotic car rental company. And I get a lot of calls like this, and I've helped a few companies kind of in a consulting capacity, kind of get their feet under them, help with the first few problems that you have to solve, and just kind of hit the ground running with these types of businesses. They did a good job. I sold them 5 or 6 cars that they could use that were kind of the right cars with some miles or some stories that were the right things to put more miles on and add more stories to. And it did okay, but like most exotic car rental companies, they started to run into some issues, some car crashes, some accidents, some difficult customers and things like that. And so eventually their investors decided, look, I'd kind of like whatever money is still out there to come back. And so they liquidated the cars, but they wanted to stay in the business. And what they told me they wanted to do was to start renting out other people's cars. And anytime you're in the exotic car rental business, I mean, I know every day, literally, I would get a call from an exotic car owner thinking they were doing me the biggest favor in the world by offering to let me rent their cars out as part of my fleet. But there are really 3 problems with this idea. The first is that there's really not enough money to go around. We talked about how the rental rates that you can charge today are so far less on a percentage basis of the value of the car that there's no money to be made in the industry anymore. And Turo's done this, and people who have done this type of thing have just driven the prices down, and it's just a very, very hard way to earn a living. So even if you can convince an owner to take too little for the time and the miles you're going to use your car, there's just not enough money to go around. The second issue is that in the event that a car gets totaled, the renter's insurance is going to pay out what the car is actually worth, not what the guy owes. And generally, the people that ask you to rent their cars out have huge loans against these cars that have faced some depreciation, and they're just trying to keep afloat and make their payments. And so they'd have to write a check to make up their negative equity in the event that the car gets totaled. But both of those issues pale in comparison to the third issue, and that is theft by the renter. Like we learned about with Lucky and the 612 and the Gallardo, when you rent a car and you do something other than just go drive it around, that is considered theft by conversion. And in the scenario where someone else owns the car and you act as an intermediary to rent it to a customer, you don't carry insurance on that car. It would just be too expensive and the policies just don't exist. The owner's policy won't cover it because it's a commercial activity, and the renter's policy won't cover it because that would be like me calling my insurance and saying that I stole my own car. That's not a real thing. So a few weeks ago, this company who was renting out other people's cars had an Audi R8 go missing. And it went from Tennessee, they brought it to Atlanta, and they told me where the tracking device had stopped working, and the car was nowhere to be found. The customer wasn't answering his phone, the credit cards had been canceled, everything was going poorly. And they were going through the steps with the owner of trying to figure out how they're going to recover it, if it can be recovered, offering rewards around and things like that, but the car hadn't turned up. So last week on the 4th of July, I got a bunch of phone calls from the owner of this company at about 12:30, 12:45 in the morning. And I didn't answer the first few, but eventually I saw who it was and I answered. And I said, hey, what's going on? He said, Ed, we just had somebody rent our Lamborghini Huracan and they're driving as fast as they seem to be able to towards Atlanta, and we're worried that it's about to go away. I said, well, that's a valid concern. I think you should call the cops. They're like, Ed, we're not having any luck with the Audi, with the Atlanta cops. I don't know what we're going to do. Can you please just go try to figure out where they're taking the car? Because they were probably 20 minutes out of Atlanta at that point. So as I left from the northern suburbs of Atlanta, I sent out a glimpse, a location service through an app to show them live where I was. And they had their updates every 30 seconds to maybe 2 or 3 minutes at a time, just depending on the granularity they were receiving from their tracking device, which I later found out was an OBD dongle that at any moment this guy could look down, see hanging there, and just throw out the window. And we'd have nothing that we could do to find the car. And so as I got down towards about Atlantic Station on 17th Street, I exited, and that's about where they were. And so I was probably 2 minutes behind them, but it was very hard for us to get to exactly the same point because they would just send me an update that would be an all new direction wherever the Lamborghini was going. So it kind of zigzagged around towards West Midtown and then up towards Buckhead, but then went over towards I-75 and was headed almost back north towards Tennessee, But around 285, they remarked as watching the satellite feed, it looked like they were trying to figure out in the Lamborghini if somebody was following them, because they went around some access road and some loops and clover leaves around the interchange there, but then they went back north on 75. And so I was following them up 75, still a ways back, certainly not in visual range, but I knew we were fairly close. They're trying to direct me as to where to get off, and in fact, they missed the exit that I should have gotten off, and I went an exit further. So they went off on some side streets in the Lamborghini, and they said, all right, he stopped. And it looks like he went into kind of a building. Let me give you the address. And they gave me the address, and it was next door to a body shop that I used to use a lot. And I don't know why I remember this body shop's address, but I did send a lot of cars there through the dealership and through the rental company. So I said, all right, I know exactly where that is. I come around in probably 12 minutes or so after they'd pulled into this warehouse, I arrive. And there's lights on the 4th of July at 2:45 in the morning in this warehouse, and it's a wrap company. And it's got there's an Aston Martin Rapide outside and a Mustang and some pretty legitimate looking cars, but it's weird that there's people in there working. So I kind of pull back out on the street and I tell the guys, look, we're not talking about any amount of money that's going to compel me to knock on these guys' doors and interrupt these would-be car thieves right now. I said, now is the time when we know where the car is. You need to call the local police in Marietta and see what they'll do. And so a few minutes later, about 6 police cars, very quietly with their lights off, pulled down this street that no one else is using at this hour. And I'm parked a few driveways down, just kind of looking at the driveway to see what's happened. And they come up and I sort of explain the circumstance and they say, all right, well, this is not really a criminal matter. I said, I know that, but this is a circumstance where they're just about to lose a very expensive car based on what seems to be happening here. And I said, could you just kind of give me some kind of help in sort of figuring out exactly what's happening to the car right now? They're like, no, I mean, it's really not our thing. Obviously it's not illegal for somebody to drive a car from Tennessee to Georgia. We understand it's against some rental agreement or whatever the case may be, but that's a civil matter. That's not for us right now. Eventually, it can become a theft by conversion circumstance, but that's not really where we're at this moment. So we don't really have any jurisdiction or probable cause to do anything. And I'm like, yeah, but it's kind of weird that a Lamborghini just pulled in here and there's lights on in this shop in the middle of the night to work on a car that's not allowed to be worked on. I mean, I know it's not exactly a criminal circumstance, but can we at least just go see what's going on? So they kind of talked amongst themselves for a little while. And in the meantime, I'm getting calls from the owner of the rental company, the owner of the car, their lawyer, everyone saying, Ed, you just have to figure out some way. We can't lose this car. And I told him, I said, look, I get it. I know this is the worst nightmare you could ever imagine. And I'm not here to say I told you so, but this is a very difficult thing to proceed through because I don't even work for you. I don't have any legal grounds to repossess this car. And if they try to make things sticky, we're not going to have a whole lot of outs here. So I keep talking to the cops and they say, all right, let's just kind of drive around there. So we do, and their lights off, very quiet, and they kind of surround the building. So I get out and one of the cops gets out and we walk in there together. And as we walk in, it's like business as usual in this wrap shop. They've got a bunch of nice cars, a new R8 and an NSX and a bunch of stuff they're in progress working on. And there's 5 or 6 employees there at 3 in the morning on the holiday, just working like it's 2 in the afternoon on a weekday. In the middle of the shop, there is a red Lamborghini Huracan, and there's this guy pulling wires out of it. He's got the dash out of the car, the whole front trunk liner's out. He's got all these tools out, and there's things laying out. I'm like, goodness gracious. And so I walk over there, and I'm like, what's going on here? And he said, this guy just sold the car, and he's looking for us to take the camera system out so he can put it in his next car. I said, well, this is actually a car he rented a few hours ago, and there's no authorization to do any work, and there's not a camera system in the car. He's definitely not allowed to do that, and we'd like you not to give him the car back. And he's like, look, I see all these cops. I'm not here to do anything wrong. If that's what the circumstance is, by all means. I'm not here to put up a fight, but I need to talk to this guy and just see what's going on. So he does a FaceTime call with the person who had dropped the car off, who was different than the female with a California driver's license who had rented the car just a few hours earlier in Tennessee. And he's like, oh yeah, man, we just went out to get some dinner at Waffle House and we'll be right there. And I certainly couldn't fault Waffle House as being the best choice of Atlanta cuisine at 3 in the morning on a holiday. But he said he was going to be back. He was calling an Uber or something like that. But he said, well, you just told me that you sold this car and you wanted me to remove that. And this guy's saying it's a rental car. He said, well, yeah. So I kind of took the phone from him. I said, hey, I'm with the rental company. We're going to be taking the car back right now. You're welcome to come back and we can discuss it. We've got the police here. Everything will be on the up and up, but we're not going to be taking things out of the car anymore, just so we're all clear. He's like, yeah, I'm on the way. Hangs up the phone. So I'm like, if you don't mind, I don't know what he was going to pay you for this job. I'll make sure that you're made whole beyond that, but just go ahead and let's try to put this thing back together, and then I'm going to end up taking it out of here. I'm going to park it in my warehouse, and then they can come pick it up in the next few days. So he gets it buttoned up, and the car starts, and this guy calls again. And I pick up his phone because he's been working, and he had no problem with that. And I'm like, look, I'm about to take this car back. Let's not worry about this anymore. You can take anything up that you have outstanding with the rental company. They'll be awaiting your call. And he's like, wait. My Uber just got canceled because my card got declined. Will you bring the Lamborghini and just come pick me up around the corner at the Waffle House? I said, yeah, you just order me around to Hash Browns and I'll be right around the corner. So obviously I did not go around the corner and pick this guy up at the local Waffle House. I'll just leave that to him and the owner of the rental company to sort out. But I was able to get the car home safe and sound to the VINwiki warehouse, and a couple days later they sent their guys down to pick it up. But I think we were really probably 15 or 20 minutes away from that car disappearing and never being seen again. And as you think about these types of businesses, all these interesting things that you can do with cars, a lot of times the risks just really do outweigh the potential reward that the industry has to offer. But fortunately in this circumstance, VINwiki was able to come to the rescue and save another stolen Lamborghini. But next time, I can't imagine we get that lucky. I need $5,000 to have it back. I said, you mean you want me to pay you for the return of my stolen property? He said, yep, that's the only way I can give it back to you. I had a customer who had rented my cars several times. In fact, he was an ex-Atlanta police officer. And he had rented the Gallardo a few times, so he wanted to rent that again. But in addition, he wanted to rent my Ferrari 612 Scaglietti so that his friend could have something to drive around while he was in town. And so about, I'd say it was on a Wednesday or Thursday, they picked up both cars and began paying for the rentals and gave us a credit card. We verified the insurance and went through all the normal steps. Over the next few days, they kept renewing the rentals, saying, we're having so much fun, we want to keep it. And I'm continuing to make a good deal of money renting the cars out, and I've got a, good customer in them, so I'm pleased with all that. But around Monday, I stopped hearing back from them. And I began telling them, well, it's time to either turn the cars back in or pay us for another day. And they wouldn't answer. And so I believe it was Tuesday night. I was out at my bachelor party because that Saturday I was getting married. And so we were out racing go-karts and having a good dinner, and I got a phone call, and it was peculiar. There was a woman on the other end of the phone, and she said, my husband is the guy who bought your Ferrari today, but we've decided we don't want it. In fact, we'd like the BMW we gave you and the $15,000 in cash as a down payment back, and we'd like to undo this whole deal. And I said, well, ma'am, literally every part of that sentence is a problem and fundamentally incorrect, because I didn't sell your husband my car, and whoever did was not authorized to do so. And she said, well, he's told us that he was one of your employees and that he worked for this rental car company. And I said, well, that's absolutely not the case. And she proceeded to tell me that, well, I'm a lawyer and possession is 9/10 of the law. I said, ma'am, it's a rental car, so possession is literally 0/10 of the law. And by saying that, I highly doubt you're actually a lawyer. But I'll need you to return to me this stolen property and understand that the police will very soon be going to find it. So she got upset, hung up the phone, and I had to return to try to enjoy what was left of my bachelor party before spending the next day and the next several days trying to work this all out. So I tried to contact the rental customer. Again, no answer. And I go on to track the cars. And I see that the Lamborghini is in a parking lot in Midtown. So I take the other key, go to Midtown, find that the car has had the front knocked off of it, and say, well, we found it at least. And so the next day I had a tow truck take it to my preferred body shop and begin the process of repairs, and we filed a claim with his insurance company. Still, he wouldn't answer the phone, and we could not find the Ferrari because the battery had gone dead. because like many of the Ferraris I've owned, the 612 was one of these cars that if you don't drive it every day or every 2 or 3 days, the battery will be dead next time you return to it. And so the tracking device was not functioning because the capacitance had worn out, and I had no idea where to find it. But I'd continued to have a little bit of luck getting in touch with this woman who was still not understanding that I didn't have her BMW or the money or access to the customer, but that she did absolutely have a car that was stolen. I came to find out that this is called theft by conversion, meaning that you had the privilege of use of this car, but that you converted it in a use that you were not permitted. So selling it was something that a rental customer was not allowed to do. So in converting it to an asset that they made for sale, that is the theft. Now the problem is, when you know who has your stolen property, the police don't do a very good job of trying to find out where it is. They seem to think that you'll go about finding it, or that it's not the same thing as throwing out an APB and having everybody find it, or at least everyone try. Because I had delivered the car in one county, and a few miles over in the next county is where the car was being used. And they were still occasionally driving it around, because I'd see the tracking device work and it would be at the valet lot of some restaurant or a mall or anything like that. But I could never get there in time to take my other key and repossess the car. So I had spoken to the police, and they said, well, yeah, we see it, but you've reported it stolen in your county and it's here, so we don't have a system that allows us to just understand every car that's stolen in the world. It seems like a market failure and something someone should explore, but they were very, very useless at the time. So I continue trying to express to this woman exactly the gravity of the situation for her, but she continues to be unwilling to return the car. So my groomsmen and I were all going around. We've got the rehearsal dinner coming up and everything's happening. And even as we led up to it, I still couldn't get in touch with the rental customer. But on Friday, literally the day before my wedding, I was finally able to talk to him, and I met him at a Waffle House, of all places. He, for some reason, had convinced himself that I might be pleased that he had sold this car, even though he had not specified a term of the loan, any interest terms, a selling price, or anything other than the fact that he had taken this guy's BMW, taken $15,000 in cash as a down payment, and agreed to some sort of payment schedule. Additional unfortunate news is that he didn't have a phone number, an address, an email address, or literally anything other than that the guy went by Lucky. So he was of very little use trying to get us the car back, even once he realized that he had made such a mistake. And so the police were starting to question him and trying to figure out things, but they weren't moving at all quickly. And I had my wedding the next day, and then I was leaving on my honeymoon the day after. And so the whole morning of our wedding, I'm constantly on the phone. We're trying to take photographs with the bridal party and everything like that. And I just can't. Literally, I cannot afford to have this go any way other than perfectly. And the reason for that is that the most difficult thing about setting up an exotic car rental company is managing the insurance. And trying to get an exotic car rental insurance policy is nearly impossible, and keeping it is also pretty much impossible, particularly if you ever file a claim. Because even though the insurance is legitimate and it's in place and it will pay out a claim, the accepted understanding on all parties is that if you file a claim, you will not be invited to renew the policy. And so while I could probably get the insurance company to pay for the theft, I would be invited not to renew, and so all the other car payments that I would need to make would not be possible because I would be out of business. So it was very much a rock and a hard place situation, and as you'd imagine, my new bride and her family and everybody else around the circumstance is pretty worried for me because they understand that this is a tremendous amount of money at risk, and all the cars are completely financed. It's not as though I own them and can just lose the money. It would be a long-term debt situation to try to recover in the event that things did not go so well. So we go through the wedding, and I'm wondering all the time, what do I do if my phone rings during the ceremony? Do I answer? Certainly I can't afford not to, but that seems like a bad decision. And fortunately that didn't happen, or I suppose unfortunately, because the next morning I still had made no progress. I called my lawyer and I said, look, I've got to leave this in your hands. There's nothing else that I can do. But please, please, please have my car by the time I get back from this week-long honeymoon in St. Lucia. And so he says he's on it, and I'm literally texting with Lucky's wife, trying to express to her the significance of the situation and the importance that she return said stolen property as we're taking off from the airport. So somehow I did manage to enjoy our honeymoon without too much stress and anxiety, but it was certainly there in the background. And when I got back in touch with Lucky, finally. I convinced his wife to have Lucky call me. And Lucky said, I've still got your car. I understand sort of what's happened, but I need $5,000 to have it back. I said, you mean you want me to pay you for the return of my stolen property? He said, yep, that's the only way I can give it back to you. I said, well, let me see what I can do. So I called the police officers that were in charge of the case, and I explained to them what had happened. They said, well, do you want to pay $5,000? I was like, well, I mean, $5,000 at this moment, particularly at the prospect of everything else that I'm going to have to spend, is a little bit daunting. They said, well, ask if he'll take a check. I said, are you insinuating that I should stop payment on said check and therefore bounce a check to someone for $5,000? Because I believe that's a felony. They said, yeah, but don't worry about it. It's okay. It'll all be fine. I said, well, okay. So called him back. Lucky was happy to take a check. Lucky's got a bank account. So go to meet Lucky where he's told me the car is. And so we go to this parking lot in downtown Atlanta, and the car is obviously completely dead. So I've got to call a tow truck to come and get it. And because you really don't want to be jumping off a Ferrari ever, and certainly not in that circumstance where you know the battery's been drained and even the alternator's questionable. So I get the truck headed that way, and at the time, Lucky and I are talking, he's hanging out. He has a friend actually drive up in this seafoam green, atrocious Maserati Quattroporte, and the paint, which had obviously been a repaint, was falling off in chunks, and so he was asking me for advice on what body shop he might use. So I made a great recommendation to him. I don't know if he ever took me up on it. Then we parted ways. I followed the tow truck home. Lucky went away with the check. So as I'm headed home, predictably, I get a phone call from the bank. They say, hey, we've got this check, and it looks a little bit suspicious, and the guy looks a little bit suspicious, and so we just really want to know what's going on. I said, yes, that's an extortion payment for the return of stolen property. Please don't honor it. There should be a stop payment in your system. Oh, great. Thank you so much, Mr. Bolian. I hope you have a great day. Well, it hadn't started out that way, but it is what it is. So we make it back to my warehouse and go on about trying to get the car charged back up and evaluating the state of things. And fortunately, it was in pretty good condition, a little curb damage on a wheel and a scratch in the clear bra, but nothing to be too terribly concerned about. But a few minutes later, Lucky shows up. His wife, I guess, had found our address, and even though we generally delivered cars to customers and didn't have a whole lot of customers here, he came to the warehouse to express his displeasure with the fact that he had not received his $5,000. I explained to him that's a felony. What you've done is extort payment for the return of stolen property, and I'm not interested in participating in that. What'll be best is if we part ways and never speak of this again. I've never seen or heard from Lucky or that customer since then, but it was definitely a very, very dramatic week in my life where the Ferrari got stolen and the Lamborghini got crashed. He said, well, that sounds like it's probably a stolen car. So for 6 years, I was the director of sales for Lamborghini Atlanta, and during that time, I sold a few hundred Lamborghinis, many of which stayed local. And I think when I started one year, we checked and there were 93 Lamborghinis registered in Georgia. I certainly increased that during the time that I worked there, and we had others that were registered in Montana and elsewhere. But over time, I became pretty familiar with just about all the Lamborghinis that were in town. And so not long after we launched VINwiki last summer, probably sometime in July, I was driving home from the office and I looked in the parking lot of the Target near my house and I saw an orange 2008 Superleggera. And I didn't think there were any orange 08 Superleggeras registered in town, and I was going to post the car to VINwiki like a lot of exotic car spotters do. So I drove down into the parking lot. And it was sprinkling rain, so I snapped some pictures through my window, but then I noticed that the car had a dealer tag on it. A reasonable explanation why it had shown up, and I didn't know anything about it, but it meant that our plate to VIN system wouldn't decode the VIN from the license plate. So I decided, well, I'll get out and I'll actually get it off the car. So as I walked up to the car, It was fascinating. It was a normal option Superleggera, but it had ceramic brakes, which were about a $15,000 option back in 2008. It was a Rancio Borealis, the pearl orange color. It had the large rear wing, the extended interior carbon package, the backup camera, and presumably navigation. Those 4 options were pretty much universal to Superleggeras. But when I looked at the VIN, there was something peculiar about it, and it was printed in the wrong font. Now, most people wouldn't know the font that Lamborghini prints their VINs in, but I did, and I knew it was wrong. So that was a little bit strange, and when I typed it into VINwiki, it didn't immediately validate the VIN. So in the US, VINs use a check digit. So the vehicle identification number, just like a credit card number, has a check digit that you can run an algorithm through, and it'll immediately tell you if it's a valid VIN. Now that doesn't work in some parts of Europe and in other parts of the world, but in the US it does. It's a law that cars sold in the US have to have a mathematically validating VIN. So that didn't validate, but I snapped a few pictures, walked around, and got back in my car and went home. But the next day when I was looking back through the pictures trying to figure out what was wrong, I noticed why the VIN wasn't validating. In fact, it was only 16 digits. So in the US, a Gallardo Superleggera VIN for 2008 would start ZHW like any Lamborghini VIN, G for Gallardo, U for the US, 43 is for Gallardo Superleggera Coupe, T for an E-gear transmission, then it'll have a check digit, then it'll have an 8 for model year 2008, then it'll say LA0, and then it'll have 4 digits that are the build number. And so in this car's case, the U wasn't there, so there was no country identifying character, and that's why the VIN wasn't validating through our system. So I thought that was pretty peculiar, so I called a friend of mine who's the chief of police in a local town and told him about it. And he said, well, that sounds like it's probably a stolen car. I said, well, that's fascinating. Let's see what we can find out. He said, let me ask around through the auto theft unit, see if anybody's looking for the car, and we'll have somebody get back in touch with you. So I thought we were onto something interesting, and I wanted to keep digging through. And it turned out that a couple other people had already spotted that same car around Atlanta, and so we were able to sort of compile the history of when it had come in on a truck and what parts of town it had been seen driving in. And with VINwiki, one of the interesting things you can do is build a list of cars. So you can add all the examples of a certain car, like 2008 Superleggeras in the US. And one VINwiki user who aspires to one day own one of these cars had gone through and done just that. So pretty much all the US Superleggeras were in VINwiki already. And we could browse through and see which ones made sense, which ones didn't have ceramic brakes, which ones were orange, because in 2008, they didn't allow any ad personam orders. They were all standard range colors. They were either white, black, gray, orange, or yellow, obviously in their Italian names. So we ruled out all the cars that weren't orange, we ruled out cars with cosmetic modifications, and we ruled out cars that had been exported, and we ruled out cars that didn't have ceramic brakes, and we got down to about 25 cars that this one could be, assuming that its VIN was wrong, and we knew that even the suffix, the build number of the VIN was wrong because it wasn't in the range of Superleggera VINs. So after that, we went through and I ran the Carfaxes and looked across all the information that I could gather on each one, and we found out that only one of these cars had ever been reported stolen, and it was VIN, I think, 6668. A few days later, I got a call from an officer with the Department of Revenue, and they had been looking into this car, and I told them that we had done some digging and we thought that the car was probably 6668. And he said, we think that too, but we were a little surprised that you were able to figure that out. I said, yeah, and I told him how we'd done it and stuff like that. And he said he didn't really know much about it, but it wasn't stolen, strictly speaking, but it was probably misrepresented to an insurance company. Not a wildly uncommon thing, particularly back in 2008 and 2009, because at the time these cars were just depreciating catastrophically, and prior to that, banks had been financing way over sticker. So it was not uncommon for the owner of one of these cars to be $150,000 upside down in equity. So it was a hard thing for them to get rid of, and the most convenient solution, it seemed at times, was just to call their insurance and say it had been stolen and collect on their insurance and potentially gap coverage as well. So he didn't have a whole lot more. He said they were going to continue looking for it, but that wasn't really good enough for me. I wanted to find out more about the car. So I went down to our local tag office and I said that I had found this car with a dealer tag on it that I wanted to buy. not untrue. I'm always interested in buying a cheap Gallardo. And so I gave her the dealer tag number, and I asked if she would just give me the dealer's name so that I could contact them and see, because obviously the car wasn't listed for sale online or anything like that. And she was very reluctant, but I convinced her to let me know what the name of the dealership was, and I found out that it wasn't terribly far from where I live. So I drove by the place where it was and walked up and knocked on the door. And I said, hey, do you guys have an orange Superleggera for sale? And the guy who owned the place wasn't there, but there was a guy subletting some part of the building for detailing. And he said, oh yeah, it's right back here. Do you want to come and take a look at it? And I said, absolutely. So I walked back there and got to have a little bit more of a look around the car, and the guy didn't care. He was happy to let somebody look. He assumed the car was for sale because he knew that it was in the building owned by a dealership. But next to the car was another 2008 Gallardo. It was a Spider. And so we were looking around both. I opened the car. It had about 39,000 miles, which I think it had been stolen with under 5,000 or under 3,000 miles when it left California. And so someone had put a lot of miles on the car. It had cheap tires and some little scuffs around the carbon diffusers and things like that. It wasn't in great shape, but it was definitely a cool orange '08 Superleggera. So I looked on the door jamb where there's the VIN sticker with all the manufacturer data on it, and it had also been altered. You could kind of see where someone had gone in and changed it, but on that one they had put the U. So it was 17 digits and wouldn't mathematically validate because the check digit was wrong, but it was a full 17-digit Lamborghini looking VIN that was probably passable to all but maybe me. I can't imagine anybody else in the state would have ever taken the time to look or have any amount of knowledge to be able to say that it didn't make sense for the car to be as it was. But I get to looking around the car, and I knew there's no real other place for me to find the car's real VIN without getting it up on a lift and looking at the frame rail. But I look in the glove box, and the owner's manuals are there. And whenever we got a new Lamborghini from the factory, we would take out the owner's manual, and there's a warranty and maintenance book. And on it, there's boxes, 17 of them, to write in each character of the VIN. And whoever had gotten this car or purchased it as a stolen car and was using it hadn't bothered to throw that away. So I opened it up and looked, and lo and behold, that's exactly which car it was, the one we thought, the one the Department of Revenue thought it was. And so I took a picture and told the guy, hey, have the owner call me. I'd love to talk to him about buying the car, stuff like that. Obviously, I never heard from him, but I followed back up with the Department of Revenue and gave them the information that they had, and also told them about the other car, which had an identically replicated VIN. And someone had really gone through some trouble here. You'd have to have removed the windshields to install the new VIN plates. But they were thrilled with this silver platter case of auto theft and to discover. And I guess they didn't have to worry about, trying to corroborate any of the other information because it was all presented to them nicely packaged. So I talked to another friend on the police force that was in that area, because it was a different area than the chief of police that I knew, and he said that they were going to go in and get them. And so I tried to talk to them a few days later, and they were obviously hugely grateful that VINwiki had been such a help collectively to figure out what the plight was of these cars. And I asked him, did the guy tell you how he came about them or what he had found or whatever the case may be? Because over the years, I'll be honest, I've been offered to buy some stolen cars, stolen exotics, and they don't tend to bring much money because there's not that much you can do with them. I remember I got offered a stolen '03 360 Spider. It was when they were worth probably 130 grand. And he said it was in South Georgia, wrapped in aluminum foil, because he wasn't sure if there was a tracking device that might have been telling the people where to come and find it. And it was exactly the same case as this, where he had been upside down, couldn't sell the car, and rather than getting it repoed, he just reported it stolen, got it paid off, and then hid the car. He said, you can have it for 25 grand, but you have to go and pick it up. And so obviously I was not interested in doing that. But for plenty of people that might want to track car or to export something or whatever the case may be, there's a lot of fun to be had for 25 grand. And that was certainly what had happened here. But the guy who'd had the car for so long was in trouble for a lot more. So in fact, I don't even believe he was prosecuted for grand theft auto, because the cops said that when they got there were all these illegal drugs and weapons and other things hidden in the walls of this car dealership lot unit, whatever the case may be. And so they didn't really bother too much with the Lamborghinis, but I was curious who I could try to buy these things from, because theoretically they were going to be owned by insurance companies. So I called Lamborghini Newport Beach and I asked them to run the actual VIN and to see who the titled owner was. And they told me that it was titled to Manhattan Leasing and that the second lien holder was All Points Capital. All Points Capital is one of these banks that does secondary lending through different leasing companies like Manhattan Leasing. They'll do balloon loans with 35 to 55% residual and a 60 or 48 month term. And so I was familiar with them. If we had someone with not quite good enough credit to go with any of the other banks, we'd sometimes call Manhattan. So I called them up and I talked to the president and I said, hey, are y'all missing an orange 2008 Superleggera? He said, you know, we're missing a few cars, let me check. He said, yep, that one's mine. And so I explained to him the circumstance, said I'd found it, and he was extremely grateful, he seemed, and told me that, you know, he'd send me a $5,000 check for finding the car, which I was thrilled with. Unfortunately, he never did that. I never heard another word from him, and after following up, he seems to have decided that it wasn't worth that to return his car. But it was a cool experience. It was a demonstration of the power of VINwiki, the way we can crowdsource information to achieve an outcome that other platforms, other sources of information never could. The cops were grateful. They've asked us to find other stolen cars, and we've made progress to that since then. But it was a great experience, a great time, and a fun little chase. Again, thank you guys so much for watching. I can't express my gratitude enough for the chance to tell the stories here and to continue doing fun things in cars. I'm sure there'll be a lot more to come, but thanks so much. Please subscribe and have a great day.